I think we're at the point where we would like to see if anyone in the audience has any questions for our panelists.
Well, from a very excited religious leader, it turned to sadness very quickly. And he walked away, and as he left that item that he was so excited about, I saw a tear come down on his face. And he said to me in our language, he says, just let him have it. And it was just, you could feel the whole place just deflated. I mean, just what was so exciting possibility that we left it. We just didn't take it home. And it seems like thereafter, we didn't get much excitement out of those things that came in anymore. Oh.
Yeah, it's certainly in our institution that we don't, ask anything, along those lines. Basically, we follow like the letter of the law, go through the official tribal government, but we don't basically try to determine, who it, really belongs to or what it's used for or whatnot. But then again, fortunately, in the Southwest, though, what certainly this other institution should have known better is that there are these keepers of traditional knowledge or cultural practices that are still very, very active. That that type of, in a sense, skepticism isn't warranted here.
Yeah. So you put your finger on the issue. We all talk about the term collaborative museology. I don't know how familiar it is to people here, but this goal of basically the work that we're doing around research, display, uses of cultural heritage in the museum setting. The idea is you do it with the communities most invested, their belongings. But exactly the issue is, well, how much collaboration how many curators are there to how large a collection? And one of the things that we've realized is the best will might be to collaborate with everyone, right? But the reality is there's only so many relationships and there's only so much time that any individual person has or any community has, as you can see. It takes a lot of work building these relationships, and sometimes food, housing, education, work come first. So there's other things that perhaps may not be the priority. That said, so we, as part of our mission mandate of our museum, we put British Columbia First Nations first, but that does not, we actually did, for a partnership of peoples, we have worldwide collections at our museum, and that includes not just Asian, Pacific, what have you, but also European, African. And so even though we're known for First Nations Northwest Coast belongings, we tried our best to work with as many communities of origin as possible, and if not that, then we worked with diasporic communities. So for example, we have a curator that works in the Pacific, and we have a very strong Fijian community in Vancouver. So she ended up working with Fijian community in Vancouver, or when she was working with our African collection, which was mostly objects that came in from donors, so it wasn't collected by anthropologists who knew what they were doing. A lot of it is what you would call tourist art, which doesn't lessen its value, but means that it didn't come in with a lot of cultural information. She worked with the African student population at UBC. So basically, collaborative museology requires very creative interventions, but we haven't solved the problem of succession. So when a curator retires, those relationships that may have been 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the building can't just be passed on to the inheritor of that position, that it really comes down to trust in individuals, not so much trust in institutions. And that's one of the things that collaborative museology hasn't really kind of resolved, I think. That it really does come down to, and we have all sorts of paperwork to try to make things more transparent. So for example, informed consent, ethics, where if you go and interview, let's say, an artist or a community member for an exhibit or for research, they're going to have a piece of paper that explains where, what's happening with that recording, that they have right to review it, that they have the right to keep it, that they have right to have it destroyed at any time. But even the best informed consent doesn't, you can't know where knowledge is going to go. It's very hard to police it. in that way. And down the road, too, people are loath to sign off on informed consent in perpetuity. Because also how you feel about that knowledge changes. You know, this isn't anyway, I'm getting distracted, but thank you for the question.
Yes, ma'am, here in front.
Well, at the Denver Museum, pretty much everyone who's donated to us, at least in the last 30, 40, 50 years, has signed a donation form that essentially gives the museum exclusive ownership and rights over the item that's been donated. So in a legal sense, there's not much that donors can do to intervene in potential repatriations or actual repatriations. There's certainly a diplomatic issue at times. And I think it's something we take seriously, certainly at Denver, in that we acknowledge that a lot of donors see themselves as caretakers and stewards as well. And I think it's important to honor that and acknowledge that. But at the same time, we have legal obligations, and then we also have our ethical obligations. And luckily, at the Denver Museum, we have a very, I think, expansive ethics policy that really compels curators to enter into serious, meaningful dialogue with descendant communities and with Native Americans. And so basically that's sort of the guiding, those are the guiding principles of the institution, because we have the board directed us to essentially enter into fundamentally reciprocal relationships with source communities, with Native peoples. So I think we work with donors and try to let them know and create a dialogue, but we also, for those that might resist it, and we actually haven't, I don't think, really come across that too much, but if that were to happen, I think it's really just explaining our own ethical principles, and we're trying to fulfill those.
There's Western legal language of ownership, and then there's recognizing other forms of indigenous legal systems of ownership, which can be very different. I mean, often, physically the West thinks about objects as, well, they make a huge differentiation between people and things. And objects can be owned and people can't anymore, thankfully. But with many of the communities I work with, that division is not nearly so clear. And also often the relationship isn't really one of ownership so much as the object is a embodied supernatural relationship that gives them privileged knowledge and access to powers. And so you steward it, you pass it down, you respect it. It's seen as like a relative or an ancestor. It has to be cared for in a certain way. Can I actually give an interesting example of a repatriation that occurred between the United States and Canada to my museum, via my museum? Because sometimes we play around with the law in all different ways. So the Burke Museum at the University of Washington in Seattle had for a very long time a stone figure that had been donated to them 100 years, and it was just sitting in one of the scientists' labs. And it was actually a very well-known Stalo stone figure called Tiqualatza. It was an ancestor that had been turned to stone and had gotten lost. It had been guarded and watched for years and years, and it ended up being left in a field when the US-Canadian border came in. It ended up at the Burke Museum. Now, NAGPRA actually the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act does not include outside of the United States. The NMAI, the Act for NMAI does, so they can repatriate to South America or Canada, but not NAGPRA. So what the community did, the Stalo community in British Columbia did, was when they found Tiqualatza was there, first they tried to repatriate under NAGPRA as an ancestral remains. And they were told, absolutely not, this is a stone object. Tiqualatza is not a person, though that already defied, so they were forced to change the quality, the request for repatriation to cultural patrimony, which is very important cultural object. And what they did was they did it through a relative community in Washington state who repatriated for them. I believe it was the Nooksack community, and then it was brought over into British Columbia. So it was given by the Nooksack once they had repatriated it legally. It was brought into British Columbia, and Tikulatsa actually spent quite a bit of time in our museum at the Museum of Anthropology. And every night, the curator that works with the Stalo, Sue Raleigh, every night she put a blanket over Tikulatsa and put him to bed, and every morning when she came back, she took off the blanket and she woke him up. And so we treated it, so, and I mean, I guess it didn't have to spend time in our museum, but what it did was, and he had a little boat, like a little canoe boat that he traveled around and was doing this work. And then eventually it went back to his home community to where there is a Chief Tikulatsa still living and doing his work. But I think the time it spent in our museum and the way it sort of had to go through these machinations of various contexts, you know, show that you can work the system. You can get around those legal terms.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, it's a perceptive comment, and I think it exactly raises these issues of how, as museum and curators or administrators, how do you negotiate these different worlds and fulfill your legal obligations, but at the same time try to do the right thing and acknowledge these different knowledge systems where the objects truly belong.
I think as Governor Suina mentioned too, something that also happens in this region is that among the pueblos, they will work with one pueblo to take the lead. They'll take the lead on certain projects or like repatriation issues. Particularly, as he's mentioned, if one is a little better well-suited or a little well-heeled, more well-heeled, and that they have the personnel, time, and budget to be able to handle some of those issues, which can, you know, then help make that partnership possible with some of the other villages to make things a little easier.
Yeah, thank you for raising that really important issue. So specifically in regards to some of these recent auctions, there are different organizations of museum anthropologists, archaeologists, and cultural anthropologists who've supported the tribes. So I'm a current board member of the Society for American Archaeology, and we've, working with the Zuni tribe and the Hopi tribe and others, we've written letters of support in every instance that they've invited us or asked for our support, both to government officials to try to create U.S. policy that would be more proactive, and also writing directly to the auction houses. So I think it is an issue that there's a lot of, I think, shared concern around and a desire to really work together to address what are really tragic processes or events. And I mentioned in 2014, I had the chance to go to Europe with Octavius Seautua, a Zuni elder, and we went to 5 major museums, the British Museum, the Musée de Quai Branly, and others around Europe with these major collections, because they had Ahayuda, they had war gods. And there's no international law or treaty currently that will allow the Zunis to legally reclaim their living beings, and they don't see them as objects either. We also met with the US ambassador in Paris, and he basically conveyed how just fundamentally differently the Europeans look at Native American culture and history and these objects, and that he was suggesting that there's going to be years and years of work to really get something in place that would empower tribes to repatriate objects outside the United States, or specifically in Europe. So I think it's just all the more important that anthropologists and museum professionals and tribes really try to work together. There's a woman named Honor Keeler who's trying to bring together a lot of tribes and supporters, and I would love to see that gain some momentum. So I think it's on the museums as well to really step it up and be active supporters in that effort.
Exactly. Again, because since how the law doesn't really touch international things or private collections, one small thing that institutions can do is basically kind of what SAR is doing right now, is to have these types of these programs, that try to educate people and hopefully in some sense, collectors, and about this idea, and this different perspective of ownership and of the value of these things have, far beyond monetarily what they mean to their home communities. And so by having these programs like these, hopefully in some way you might touch someone. Granted, it's going to be like water dripping on a rock. It's going to take a lot of time and slowly, but over time, hopefully this will have an effect, and that things will change, and hopefully eventually.
I guess for me, I still see museums and other avenues of dispensing information and sharing objects. It still caters to a certain class of people, a certain education level of people. I don't think we've really gotten it to the Native community. So I think key in all of this is the schools. I think we need to, I know you've in the past have had some programs here that cater to the schools, to Indian schools, children, and so forth. But I think if we are ever going to achieve success in understanding museums, appreciating museums, and having those things available for us that are really ours, in an education sense, I think we need to get the children into the schools. The other thing I want to say is that although I may have come across very negative about NAGPRA in the last 25 years, it hasn't been. I don't want to leave you with that impression because it's gotten us talking. I mean, here we are this evening doing just that. And 25 years is just a drop in the bucket when we look at 2,000 years of our culture and those items that are sitting there. And the law is the law. It's the attitude and the disposition that we develop out of this in the working relationship with museums and communities, Indian communities. So looking forward to doing that in the next 25 years. It's going to take time, but it is what it is.
Actually, I think that might be a good spot to leave that. And again, thanks to SAR, the Coe Foundation, and all of you for coming out tonight and supporting this series. And again, please join me in giving our panelists a final round of applause.